This video is the last in a series for this week that focus on how do you read scholarship. And as you know, what I wanted to do in this video was to focus on the content of the article that I asked you to read for this week. The article being, Do Course Evaluations Truly Reflect Student Learning? Evidence from an Objectively Graded Post-Test. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to step you through some of the content in this article and try to read and respond to it as though I have relatively little experience with scholarship and especially with statistics, because of course this article does feature quite a bit of numerical information. It gives you equations, etc. So I'm just going to try and come at this as though I don't have a very strong background in reading scholarship. So the first thing I want to start with is the abstract, which of course is toward the top of the first page. And in a previous video I kind of talked to you a little bit about this, but I'm just going to start here again. So in this first sentence, we're already starting to set up the significance of this particular research. So the authors write, it is difficult to assess the extent to which course evaluations reflect how much students truly learn from a course because valid measures of learning are rarely available. So that's a broad general statement, and what it does is it starts to suggest that, okay, well the topic of this article, like the title indicates, will be about course evaluations and learning. And what we're trying to get at here is that it's really challenging to determine the relationship between course evaluations and learning. So they're starting to suggest that in some way they're going to respond to this challenge. And then of course in the next sentence they offer us that response and the purpose of this article. So they say this paper makes use of a unique setting in which students take a common high-stakes post-test which is centrally graded and serves as the basis for capturing actual student learning. We match these student-specific measures of learning to student-specific course evaluation scores from electronic records and a rich set of student-level covariates, including a pretest score and other measures of skills prior to entering the course. So these two sentences are starting to get us to methodology a bit. While small in magnitude, we find a robust, positive, and statistically significant association between our measure of student learning and course evaluations. So that last sentence, it identifies for us a summary of the major finding, and then it also tells us what this article contributes, that essentially these researchers have overcome this challenge of determining the relationship between course evaluation and student learning because they're finding in their research a statistically significant association between using that post-test, which is their unique contribution, and course evaluations. So that kind of steps you through the abstract. So let's get into the introduction. And remember, the introduction and the abstract in some ways are similar. So this intro opens with the same kind of contextualizing broad background information. It tells us that student evaluations of courses are the most common evaluation tool in higher education today. And that sets up for the reader that this is an important topic to investigate because institutions are relying on these course evaluations and relying on them heavily. And it tells us that scores on course evaluation forms are used by many university stakeholders as a measure of the transmission of knowledge in a course. So course evaluations are used by a lot of different people in higher learning. It's not just, one unit or one segment. So we know course evaluations are used by faculty, they're used by department chairs, they're used by higher up administrators, and it just kind of goes on from there. Then in the next sentence, you'll notice that we start getting citations of literature. So since the widespread use of course evaluations in higher education began in the 60s and the 70s, there's been a flurry of papers investigating the relationship between evaluation scores and various measures of student learning. So then we get all of these citations in the parentheses, and this is important because it establishes credibility for the authors, right? It shows that they've already done some preliminary research, they know what's out there, and they know what the prior studies have focused on. You'll see then in the next sentence that we start to get to the suggestion of what the gap in the literature is. So what don't we know from the literature despite the fact that we have all of these already published studies? So the authors write, a recent review concludes that a general consensus has not been reached concerning the validity of this relationship, largely due to the challenges associated with obtaining valid measures of student learning. And this of course reflects the abstract. So in that sentence what they're telling us is that although there is all this research out there, what we found is that there's not actually a consensus, there's not agreement about whether course evaluations actually are valid measures of student learning. And this is in large part because it's difficult to determine that relationship. There are a lot of challenges to it. So in the next paragraph, what's important is that now we've already identified a gap in the literature, the fact that we don't have this consensus, and we've given a reason for it. It has to do with all of these challenges. So when we get to this next paragraph, many researchers have viewed, etc., that's where the authors start pointing out for you some of the faulty reasonings or problems of the previous studies. So in this paragraph, the authors are telling you that previously several researchers said that there was a positive correlation or relationship between student grades and scores on student course evaluations, and that we could use that to tell us whether or not students were learning. And then the authors explain to you using that however word, that contrast word, that it's actually not clear that higher course grades reflect student learning, that they reflect more learning, that there could be other factors that influence those kinds of numbers. So for example, the scores that we're seeing may actually be due to the students coming into those courses already having a lot of ability, being really strong in that subject matter. It could be that the instructor grades really leniently, that they're an easy grader. And it could even be that the class meets at a particular time of day where students tend to be in a better mood. So we can't assume, despite what previous research has done, that higher grades and greater student satisfaction automatically equate to higher learning or a higher degree of learning. Another problem that the researchers point out for you with prior scholarship is this assumption that grades in later courses are a measure of student learning. And in this paragraph, continuing on to page 2, the researchers address this assumption that's been made. And then at the very end of this paragraph, we see where the researchers are coming back to what will essentially become the significance of their study in this article. This idea that we need an objective measure of student learning in the specific course under evaluation, and so that we can really understand that relationship between course evaluations and learning. So then we continue into the next paragraph. And what I want to do is just point out for you, again, where they're identifying how the data could possibly be skewed in research. So what they're indicating in this particular paragraph is that course evaluations, they tend to be anonymous, and so they're not directly connected to student grades. And so this could cause a problem if we're looking at course evaluations as a measure of student learning, because if we can't identify which students are completing the evaluations, then we don't know whether we're really getting a representative sample of students. And later in the article, they of course identify for you which groups tend to complete course evaluations the most, have a higher response rate, things like that. And so if we know that there's this possibility that when we're looking at course evaluations, we're not really looking at student evaluations that represent the whole, that they're kind of distributed across, the grade ranges and what students actually learn, etc., then it's difficult for us to claim that course evaluations are valid reflections of student learning because we're only looking at a small subset of the course. All right, you'll notice that in the introduction where it says this paper, that's where the authors are identifying for you the purpose. And they even use this word unique, which helps to establish what it is they'll contribute that makes their research different and significant, what's important about it. Notice as well, they further build on this idea of what's significant. They say our data contain other attractive features. So certain keywords are appearing in this article that are meant to communicate this idea that the article is valuable, that the research does contribute something that's important for us. If we look at this complete paragraph at the top of the page here on the second column, this is where we're getting a summary of the major finding. And then we see in this same paragraph where the authors are arguing for the validity of their results because they say they find a negative and always statistically insignificant relationship between course evaluations and this proxy for learning. And so statistical significance, if you're not familiar with statistics, that's what you're really always trying to aim for. You do want to make sure that your results are significant because that demonstrates that they're valid, all right, that they withstand certain measures that they hold up. So when we get into section 2, if you remember from one of the other videos, this is where we start getting a description of methods. And so the authors are stepping us through the sample that they were working with, so who were these students and also who were the teachers who they were coordinating with for their data. And you'll also see that they tell us as well what the years were for their data collection. And of course, we know from the first page that this article was published in 2012, so we can see this data are a few years old. And you probably notice I refer to data as plural. Data is plural. The singular form of data is datum. So if you're using the word data in your paper, remember that data is plural. Okay, it's not singular. If you want the singular form, that's datum. Right, that was a little bit of a tangent, got a little off topic there. So anyways, if we continue then on to the next page, one thing I want to note for you is that there is discussion of how grade distribution can be a factor in evaluations. And this gets to where they're discussing how these instructors may have as much as 2 letter grade differences between their mean grades, even though they're working with some common materials, that the grading is left up to them. And so we may see some variances there because there can be such a distribution of grades. Again, in this next paragraph, we get some more discussion of validity. You'll see they say the post-test appears to be a valid instrument. And notice they're using this qualifier, appears to be, rather than firmly stating that it is, they're just saying it seems like it is. And that's important. When you're reading scholarship, you want to look for those kind of qualifiers. We also get more discussion of significance of the effective measure and what they're looking for. Again, we get discussion of validity if we scroll further down, because they're trying to, the researchers are showing that, well, these students fill out these course evaluation forms just before the final exam period begins, and so they don't actually know what their performance on the post-test will be. However, there is a possible sort of limiting factor in terms of they do know what their score is on these 700 points. So the researchers are trying to indicate the validity of what they're doing, but then also acknowledge a possible issue that could compromise. All right. If you continue to look here as well, we see another mention of the problem with relying on course evaluations or a potential problem. Assuming that students do give high scores to instructors who grade easily, then of course there's an incentive for instructors to grade more easily, and so it kind of becomes a cycle of, well, students reward the instructor for grading easily by giving them a good evaluation, so then instructors respond by continuing to give easy grades. So the authors are trying to point out for you all throughout this article possible limitations on course evaluations and how we gauge student learning. We get more discussion of the sample all throughout this page. And then, of course, when we get onto page 712, that's where the authors toward the bottom discuss for us those populations that are more likely and less likely to complete evaluations. And so, again, they're trying to point out for you factors that could influence course evaluation results. So I'm starting to run out of time with this video, so I just want to kind of jump ahead of certain parts of this article. So if you look at section 4 where results, that's the title of it, you'll see where the dependent variable, which is what they're measuring for, is identified here, which is the numerical score on the particular survey. If we go to the next page after that, we see where the researchers are, again, emphasizing the validity of their findings, that the inclusion of student ability controls strengthens their findings, and they kind of scatter language like this all throughout. They also identify for you in the paragraph here on this right side of the page the limitations. So they mention it's possible they failed to proxy for some student level trait, right? And that's important. You want to look for any indication of limitations of the results. And they use that to set up future research. So what else could be done in the future to study this? Notice on page 715, they're referring you to the results identified in columns 1 through 4. And they're identifying for you that this relationship could be small. So you also want to look for language like this where the researchers are calling attention to the limitations of some of the results that were found. Notice on page 716 here toward the end of this paragraph, they again are emphasizing the validity of their particular method and their findings, although they also include that qualifying word if. And again, you're always looking for qualifiers and limitations when you're reading this. finally, notice on page 718 right here that they reiterate what their argument is. And in this paragraph, they also mention additional factors of